Good evening, everybody. Thanks for joining us. My name is Nancy Morgan, the coordinator of the Virginia chapter of American Promise. We're delighted that you're spending this Friday evening with us. It's a beautiful evening in Virginia, so we're glad that you've made a decision to join us in this interesting roundtable discussion on challenges in passing campaign finance legislation. I think that we have a very interesting panel. And certainly it needs to be said that this is an auspicious time for discussing this issue in Virginia. Today was the last meeting of a legislative study committee on campaign finance reform. And we're hoping that the committee and the report, which comes out in the beginning of November, will actually provide a roadmap for legislative action that translates into legislation being introduced and passed in our next General Assembly. And it's noticeable that this is happening in what will likely be the most expensive gubernatorial race in Virginia's history. So thanks for joining us. This discussion is sponsored by Virginia Our Way and American Promise. My colleague Heidi Drauschik will introduce the panel after I give a brief overview of what's the status of money in politics in Virginia and nationally. And just a quick shout out to groups who are co-sponsoring the INVET, which in addition to our Money Out group, Virginia Our Way, we have the Virginia Justice Democrats, we have Action, Virginia Democrats Forward, and the Virginia Political Cooperative. So let's just get into a quick review of what's happening in terms of money in politics. First of all, what is American Promise? American Promise is a national organization, nonprofit, nonpartisan, which is unique in the democracy reform space because it specifically focuses on introducing a constitutional amendment to the US Constitution, which allows Congress and the states yet again to resume their role to regulate election spending. As we'll see later, this has been eroded over by 40 years of Supreme Court ruling. And when we started 4 years ago, our group decided we would be remiss if we didn't focus on campaign finance and ethics reform in our pay-to-play state of Virginia. Why? Well, because we the people, not money, super PACs or corporations should govern. Why should we care about money in politics? I bet those out there among you can find out what areas you're interested in. Certainly Natalie Penn is from Loudon, is interested in climate change, Virginia energy policies. Others care about spiraling drug prices, dysfunctional healthcare system, mass incarceration, private prisons, money going into that, nursing home care. Broadband is a big issue of concern in Virginia. And in poverty programs, I came off 20 years working as an economist for the UN, most recently in Tunisia, concerned about food security, good governance, poverty reduction. So that was my entry point for action. But certainly 2020 was a blowout year in terms of election and spending. You can see here, this is Open Secrets data, that basically 2020, it doubled from 2016, totaled at $14 billion. Obviously, it's both presidential, congressional. But when you looked at the congressional races, you had 2 Senate seats in Georgia that were at least $500 million. Even in poor Maine, such a small state, they had at least $200 million coming in from out of state to influence that election. And a lot of that is independent spending, meaning not affiliated with the candidate itself, coordinated with the candidate. It's independent spending can be the dark money, which is in the 501c3s, where you don't know where that money come from, or the more nebulous super PACs, which are required to actually report to the Federal Elections Committee. But obviously this year was record spending in terms of independent expenditures also. So why are we here? I think we just have to look at the 40 years of court decisions by the Supreme Court. Certainly, I'd just like to say it's of interest that all roads lead to Richmond. And if you were in Richmond in 1972, maybe you saw Lewis Powell. Who was Lewis Powell? He was a corporate lawyer, and he was talking at the time to the chair of the Chamber of Commerce, and they drafted the Powell Memorandum, which basically set the stage for businesses increasing their influence through political power. And it's interesting to note that then he was appointed the next year as a Supreme Court justice. That sort of set the stage for a series of Supreme Court rulings. Buckley versus Vallejo is the most notable. For the first time, election spending limit was struck down using the free speech as the reason. And this, I didn't realize this until later, but this is the Supreme Court ruling that doesn't allow you to limit spending by independently financed candidates like Bloomberg, like Youngkin, who's running for Virginia governor. So that's the Supreme Court ruling, which means that you can't limit spending. 1977, First National Bank Bilotti unlimited corporate spending and ballot initiatives. I wish Virginia were a ballot initiative state, but certainly they limited any money limits on going into those ballot initiatives. And of course, the infamous 2010 Citizens United versus the Federal Elections Committee. And that's the one that unleashed the floodgates in terms of the money we saw in that previous graph. Unlimited election spending by corporations and unions deemed free speech. And for those of money in politics trivia people, Citizens United was a Virginia company. 2011 ATP versus Bullock, Bullock being the governor of Montana. They extended their ruling to strike down election spendings in Montana and dozens of other states. And 2014 McCutcheon and versus Federal Elections Committee, it didn't allow limits, aggregate limits, to be imposed for federal candidates. This had a big impact on at least 22 states who had to roll back their campaign finance laws, and certainly in Montana, which had 100 years of bans on corporate money going into their elections. It struck down 100 years of Supreme Court of campaign finance rules. So thanks again here's our message on free speech. Thanks again to the Supreme Court. My free speech is worth more than yours. So when you look at Virginia, Virginia was not a state affected by those rulings because basically it's one of 5 states which has no limits on campaign contributions. And more egregiously, perhaps, it has no limitations on personal use of campaign finance funds, which means basically that you want to take my money that I give you and fly to Paris or pay your mortgage or pay for your children's education, no problem. But we've seen the same escalation. As you can see, it's basically the same trend in terms of growth of spending in 2019 in our Senate and our House races totaled $121 million, obviously a record. Well, this year, 2021, we have the House of Delegates and the statewide offices, the governor's race, as I mentioned, will probably be a blowout. The last cost in 2017 of that election was $66 million. I bet you, if you want to put a $10 on a bet, I bet you it will be over 80 million. So you can see that how our spending in Virginia mirrors the escalating trend in other states nationally. When you look at the Virginia graveyard of campaign finance bills, you have to remember there's a 30-year discussion on campaign finance in Virginia. The Governor Wilder's commission report released in 1994 recommended limit. This was followed up by the McAuliffe report in 2014. They wanted ethics reforms. They wanted various campaign finance reform, which came to nothing. I think we estimated in a citizens report on the need for campaign finance reform. We did an analysis, and since 2015, there have been over 100 bills, 120 bills, campaign finance bills introduced. Only a few of them got passed, and they were usually minor, not structural issues like electronic filing. Just, I think that this year, the last General Assembly is pretty indicative. There was a limits bill introduced, defeated in committee and Senate, banning campaign donations from public service corporations, died in the House and the Senate, banning corporate contributions, died in the House subcommittee, and Sam Rasoul was actually a member of that committee, and we had testified, so that was was an interesting case. Restricting personal use of campaign contributions. This has been introduced the last 5 or 6 years. It went past the Senate or the House 100-0 and died in the Senate. The only thing that passed was establishing a joint subcommittee to study comprehensive campaign finance reform, which is the committee that I referred to you having done the 4 meetings. They're probably going to extend into next year. And then there was a resolution that we got passed, our group, American Promise, appreciating the need for a constitutional amendment. 21 other states have had states pass resolutions saying we want Congress to pass a resolution allowing us to regulate election spending. We couldn't get that through, but we did get halfway there, an appreciation for the issue. So because of lack of transparency and accountability, both on ethics and campaign finance, Virginia rates 46 on the Swamp Index. This is a cross-state index generated by the Coalition for Integrity. You can see that Virginia is 46, only followed by Utah, Michigan, Arizona, Idaho, and Wyoming. So where are we now? Well, at least through this subcommittee, we're hoping that they're going to really look at strengthening the institutional capacity of our state board of elections. They have no regulatory oversight, don't do investigations, can't subpoena, do no auditing. So we're optimistic that something will get through. Improving disclosure, including Austin Graham, one of our panelists, testified today. Some of the best practices on campaign finance were introduced on independent expenditures. We're hoping that we at least move in that direction like other states. And there will be a bill restricting personal use of contributions. The importance of you and your voice in Virginia and around the country is because we can't do this without you. We need to have everybody raise their voice. We're doing it through legislative advocacy, having listening sessions with legislators, testifying at hearings. We're engaging with the media, knowing journalists, writing press releases, letters to the editor, and certainly community outreach like this to inform the public on why this is an important issue. So with that background, I'm really pleased to introduce our first speaker. We have Trevor Potter, who is the president of the Campaign Legal Center, which is one of the preeminent national organizations and probably the only entity that actually is doing significant legislation or significant litigation on campaign finance. And it's very interesting because even before he was president of the Campaign Legal Center, he was a federal commissioner at the Federal Elections Commission. So he is a vocal critic of unlimited corporate funding. He has been described by the American Bar Association Journal as a hands down one of the top lawyers in the country on the delicate intersection between politics, law, and money. So we're really pleased to have Trevor, and I'm going to pass it over to you, and hopefully you can talk to us or give us more details on why money in politics is a threat to or everyday Americans. What are the links between federal and state laws, and advocating for reform? What is possible in the future? So thank you very much. And right now, I'm just going to turn it over to Trevor.
Thanks, Nancy, so much. It's great to be with you all tonight. The Campaign Legal Center is a nonpartisan organization. We seek to make elections better for all citizens and think that if we do that, people will have more confidence in their government and in their country and in the election system. So we're not interested in which party wins, but how to make sure that elections are fair and transparent. As you noted, there has been this wave of increased spending in the last, 20 years. If you look at your chart, a 14 billion spent in the last election, up from something like $1 billion 20 years ago. So there's been a huge increase, way above inflation. And the country has dealt with this at the federal level as well as it could in the McCain-Feingold reform law back in 2002. And as Nancy indicated, there have been a range of Supreme Court decisions that have opened up other ways to spend money, but the Supreme Court has still upheld the ability of states or Congress to limit direct contributions to candidates. So despite the decisions that Nancy mentioned in her great presentation, there is still the ability to limit individual contributions to candidates, and if a state would like to prohibit corporate or labor contributions to candidates. Now, the reason for that goes back to the Buckley v. Vallejo decision that Nancy mentioned, and that is that the court said the one legitimate grounds for regulating money in politics and campaign contributions is to prevent corruption. And as the court said in Buckley, and various justices have said since, there are two aspects to that. One is to ensure that people are effectively not bought and sold, that you don't have legislators who receive $1 million contribution and then do whatever their donor asks. That's the direct threat of corruption. But the indirect threat is if the voters think that people have been bought and sold because of the size of contributions in elections. So that's why all but 5 states, Virginia being one of them, have some limits on election contributions. And I know that Virginia has a legislative committee looking at it. Nancy has told us that the committee does not appear to be looking at contributions, but rather other aspects of elections. It's interesting because Virginia really has been a national leader in terms of enabling people to vote. This legislature has done a great job of cleaning up the election laws and ensuring that we have well-organized, transparent, but accessible elections. So Virginia is now a leader in terms of the voter ID situation, in terms of ensuring that their voters have a range of ID, photo or otherwise, that they can use to be able to vote. Virginia has early voting. It has absentee voting without excuse. So Virginia is at the top of the national charts in terms of access to the polls. But as Nancy's graph clearly points out, it is at the bottom in terms of doing something about the danger of corruption from vast, unlimited contributions to candidates. Now, it's interesting because there's another problem in Virginia elections, and that is what is often called dark money or secret money. And what that means is, even in a state like Virginia, where a corporation, a union, an individual can give an unlimited amount to a candidate or a party, there are still people who want to spend money in elections without having their fingerprints attached. And the way they do that is to give money to a not-for-profit organization under the tax code, maybe a 501c4 social welfare group you may have heard of, or to some sort of an LLC without their name on it, which then spends money in elections or gives money to candidates, so that you don't even have the disclosure that Virginia law and every other state law requires. The basic yardstick here is that even in states like Virginia, where there are unlimited contributions, citizens have the right to know, voters have the right to know who made those contributions, so they can judge, is the candidate in the pocket of the utilities? Are they in the pocket of the unions? Are they in the pocket of some other group? And so that's a basic fundamental aspect of our campaign finance laws for over 100 years, that we should have full disclosure of who is spending the money. But with this secret or dark money, what happens is groups come into Virginia, often out of state money for all we know. It's hard to know where it comes from, but sometimes information on that leaks. And they will spend the money and they'll call themselves something like, Virginians for a Better Country. and we won't know who is financing them because they won't file campaign finance reports, and we'll just see the name without having any idea of who they actually are. There are two examples in recent elections on both sides, because this is not a partisan issue. In 2017, a group called Virginians for a Better Future, how's that for a vague name, spent $184,000 to support Governor Northam during his campaign, and they didn't disclose any of their sources of funding. And then in 2021, there was a group called the Virginia Cornerstone PAC, and it said it received $114,000 from Americans for Limited Government, whoever they are. We don't know because they don't disclose their donors. But Cornerstone then spent a fortune helping to pay for numerous attack ads on Glenn Youngkin when he was trying to become the Republican nominee for governor. So we have these behind the curtain groups spending money in Virginia. And it's ironic because people like Senator Mitch McConnell, the Republican leader in the Senate, have long said we need no limits. Anyone ought to be able to spend what they want, but it should be fully disclosed. And yet, in a state like Virginia, which has no limits, we also don't have full disclosure. And in the Senate, Senator McConnell has been leading the fight to ensure we don't have full disclosure for some years now. He opposed the Disclose Act. He's opposed the various bills that are now before the Senate that would require disclosure. But I think Virginia has an opportunity, and I say this as a Virginia resident, to at least move on the disclosure side and to require that when groups are spending money in Virginia, the voters know who they are and where the money is coming from. As former Justice Kennedy said in the Citizens United decision, there was a part of that decision which was 8-1 the right way. Justice Kennedy wrote to uphold full disclosure. And he said it's important for voters to know who is speaking to them so they can evaluate the speech. To us as citizens, it makes a difference who is speaking because we judge some of the speech and whether we believe it or not by who it's coming from. And so it's important to know that. And Kennedy said the other reason that disclosure is important so that citizens will know who they think is in the, quote, pocket of the special interests. And they can keep an eye on them. So if they know that one special interest group or another spent a lot of money to get someone elected, they can then keep an eye on how that person acts in office and make sure that money hasn't corrupted them. So I think this is an opportunity for Virginia, at least in that area, to make some progress on the disclosure of sources of money. So with that said, you've got a lot of great panelists, Nancy, and this should be a good conversation. Thank you very much. On behalf of myself and Austin Graham of the Campaign Legal Center for the opportunity to talk about these broader issues with you tonight.
And thank you, Trevor. And while we still have you, I would love to ask one question that I know a couple of us from the audience had, and that is, what's your view of the possibility of passing an amendment to the U.S. Constitution, which would authorize Congress and the states to regulate election spending, from the federal side?
The Campaign Legal Center endorses the idea of such an amendment. I think it is the cleanest way to change the current Supreme Court jurisprudence that limits what we can do in terms of some of the limits on particularly corporations and so forth. The reality, of course, is that it is a huge lift. It takes a super bipartisan majority of Congress, of both houses, to pass it and send it to the states, and then it takes 3/4 of the states to ratify it. So I think it is important to focus on it. If we could wave a magic wand and have it, I think we would have a better system. But while we are waiting to build the popular momentum, or perhaps not waiting, while Heidi and Nancy and others are out there trying to build the popular momentum, there are still things we can do. And as I've noted, Virginia could have contribution limits on candidates and PACs and party committees. It could limit or prohibit corporate spending, corporate contributions directly to candidates. And it certainly could have full disclosure. So I think from my perspective, the amendment is a good goal, but we don't want to lose sight of the things that may be more quickly attainable.
Heidi, if I may ask a follow-up question to that, and I know, Trevor, what is your opinion of the constitutional convention approach? I know there have been 21 states that have passed resolutions saying they want a constitutional amendment. We're working in other states, Wyoming. I mean, this is not a red versus blue thing on a state level, talking to people. But Sam Rasoul actually introduced something that was basically a constitutional convention approach, and which 5 states have introduced these. A lot of legislators say it's very dangerous to do so. What is your view?
I am concerned about the idea of a constitutional convention because we don't have any precedent except the original one. And the original was the classic runaway convention. They were charged with drafting amendments to the Articles of Confederation, and they unanimously agreed that they should just junk the Articles of Confederation and start from scratch. I think we were really lucky that time. They had a good plan. They created something that, with changes and amendments, still stands. But the risk of a constitutional convention, of course, is that it junks our existing constitution rather than just passing that amendment. And I think in the current polarized world we're in, we have no easy way to know who states would send as delegates, but you can imagine that red states would send very red people and blue states very blue people, and how that comes out and what happens to all sorts of issues that the Supreme Court has dealt with, like the First Amendment or abortion or gun rights or all the hot button issues, religion, would all be on the floor in addition to the issue of limiting money spent in elections. So I think it would really be a gamble and one that I would be concerned about.
Well, Heidi, I don't see any. Oh, I see one. Mindy asked a question. How have the states been impacted in their ability to regulate election spending since Citizens United? Have you seen a lot of states? I mean, we mentioned that 22 states had to adjust their campaign finance laws.
Well, many states prohibited corporations from spending any money in elections, even on independent expenditures. And again, what the court did in Citizens United was it didn't limit the state's ability to regulate or prohibit direct contributions to candidates, but it limited it. The court said states can't prevent corporations from spending independently of candidates. So there's a whole battleground in the field of regulation of money in politics of what is independent spending. How independent does it have to be? And that's another area that Virginia could limit spending by corporations by saying it has to be truly independent of the candidates and parties. You can't have the candidate raising money for the committee. You can't have the candidate thanking. You can't have conversations between the candidate this outside group is supporting and the spending group on what ads would be useful or where they should run or those sorts of things. So that is still a possibility for states to do.
Well, thank you very much. I know you have another appointment, and we're going to start up with our more casual conversation with our other panelists. But
Nancy, before you,
sure.
Can I ask Trevor?
Sure.
Question?
Absolutely.
It was invoked.
You're the senior official on the panel. Go ahead.
No. So, to draw the distinction between a call for a constitutional convention and the state putting in for an amendment to the United States Constitution, the legality of that. I mean, they're really while it is true that that states have never amended the Constitution, they've come close, and every time they've gotten close, Congress has taken it into their own hands and done it themselves. It is the fact that in the 1780s there was a call to produce amendments, and it turned into a Constitution writing versus this very narrow in scope. I just want to make sure that, for my educational purposes, that there's a distinction there, that there is a call out there for a constitutional convention. Like, people want to get together and rewrite the Constitution. This, though, the application, as we have done with in some other cases in the past, is very narrowly tailored. Can you comment very briefly on the distinction there?
Sure, you're absolutely right that there have been cases where people have wanted a specific amendment and Congress has not moved on it. And so states have exercised the option they have under the Constitution to have enough states, a supermajority, call for a constitutional convention. Now, the states have said the purpose of that is to adopt the amendment, women's votes or whatever it is. And when it got close to enough states that actually there would have to be a constitutional convention, you are right, Congress then moved to enact that particular amendment on its own, thereby meaning there was no need to have a convention. So that's what's happened in the past. The risk here is not that states call for a convention and Congress then acts on campaign spending, but rather that enough states call for the convention that it actually has to occur. And so the question is, does Congress blink first? And I think the strategic answer to that is this Congress can barely agree on anything. And to get a supermajority of this Congress to say, oh, no, we don't want a convention, we'll go ahead and pass a constitutional amendment and send it to the states to restrict spending in politics. It just seems improbable. I don't think it would get any Republicans. That amendment would not get Republican support in Congress. And to the contrary, I think there are a number of members of Congress, for different reasons, who would say, great, we'd like to have a constitutional convention because there are a whole bunch of other things we want to open up. And so my point is, that has worked in the past because Congress has blinked and passed the specific amendment because they didn't want a convention. Here, I think there may be enough people who would welcome a convention, plus Congress is sufficiently deadlocked, I don't think it's going to agree on an amendment itself, that we might stumble into having the convention. And then the question is it just a convention on the one subject that the states asked for? And as you know, there are other requests for a convention to deal with a balanced budget amendment. So you could end up in a situation where the convention meets, having been asked to deal with the balanced budget or election spending, and it is totally unclear how it could then be constrained from moving on to recommend anything else it wants for the states. Now, the fail-safe is that after there's a convention, whatever they recommend then has to go back to the states and be approved. But I think the risk is it's effectively a second constitutional amendment, and we don't know what would go back to the states. I hope that answers at least the background of what you were referring to in terms of the historical record there.
We've given people some dinner time stuff to think about then. No, thank you for that, Trevor.
Okay, thank you, sir.
Thank you, Trevor. I know you have another engagement. We just wanted to thank you for your time, and we'll go on to the rest of our panelists.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. So I'm delighted to introduce Senator Jeff Golden, the state senator from Oregon. Oregon came to we were interested in Oregon because obviously in my presentation, I said that Virginia is one of 5 states with with no limitations, and Oregon is actually one of the other states. So we were monitoring that, and he wrote a wonderful op-ed in a paper, and he agreed to join us for a discussion of what happened, why didn't it happen? You had a referendum that the Oregonians want this legislation. Jeff, can you give us a little bit of background on them?
Sure, pleased to, and I'm pleased to be invited. Thank you very much for the chance to offer some thoughts. I am Jeff Golden. I live in Southern Oregon, the far side from Portland. Ashland is my town. And I'm actually towards the end of my first term in the state Senate. And what motivated me after an earlier incarnation in politics quite a few years ago to get back into politics were two issues: campaign finance reform and climate action. And I'm interested in what our track record has been since I got to the legislature, because I've been there for the two walkout sessions. In both sessions, we made national news when Republicans walked out and denied us a quorum to act on climate change. But campaign finance reform can't quite be walked out on. It is, I don't know, a more unifying issue. And I was struck when I decided to run with no PAC money, and that's no good PAC money or bad PAC money at all. I knew there'd be, although my party told me I couldn't get elected, I knew there'd be a countervailing political benefit because of the way people are feeling these days. And I had no idea. I think one of my takeaways is that incumbent politicians underestimate how powerful this issue is. Although if you say I'm going to take good PAC money but not bad PAC money, you lose all the power of that. That's kind of a separate discussion. But you are correct. We were one of 5 unregulated states altogether. That was because of a state Supreme Court decision in the late 90s. We actually had a citizens initiative in the late 90s impose very strict limits. Supreme Court said that conflicts with the free speech clause of the Oregon State Constitution. This is before anybody imagined Citizens United, which is rather peculiar because we have identical state constitutional language to a lot of states that have never said anything like that. But at any rate, that was the law of the land for a while. And there have been some other court challenges. It even, that law, that Supreme Court decision, even precluded any disclosure rules, not just contribution rules, but requirements that donors be identified. So with that, we have been the Wild West. I think we have a few distinctions, such as highest corporate contributions to legislators per capita of any state in the country, that kind of thing. Not distinctions we're especially proud of. So I became, in my freshman term, the Senate president offered to create a new campaign finance committee. There'd never been one before, and offered me the gavel. I was excited about that, and we managed to refer to the voters a constitutional amendment to make it very explicit that the legislature, local governments, and the citizens by the initiative process can regulate campaigns, primarily campaign financing. And with that, we put that on the ballot and attempted to pass some statute that would activate if voters approved the ballot measure and amended the Constitution. And we did approve some disclosure statutes. And those have to do with, Trevor was talking about Virginians for Good Government, or whatever it is. We have a friendly competition of who can come up with the sweetest name for a political action committee. Oregonians for puppies and lollipops. We have a lot of that too. So these statutes require drill down and to talk about the individual investors over a certain amount in each of these PACs, and was ready to activate if citizens did approve the constitutional amendment. And last November, they did, by the largest margin that a citizens initiative has ever been passed in this state. It was 4-1, almost 80-20. And nobody was all that surprised. And all that constitutional amendment does, it specifies nothing. It just says we're empowered to regulate campaigns. So we came back in our short session. I beg your pardon, it was a long session. Our 2021 session ran from January to June, which, with intention to prioritize a campaign limits bill, now that the voters allowed us to. And like most legislatures, we were knocked off course severely by COVID and by our catastrophic wildfires in 2020. So there was more of a crisis response session, and campaign finance did not get the attention we wanted. But at any rate, the outlines of a battle emerged. I'm very much a combatant in that battle. We have super majorities for Democrats in both of our chambers. Actually, I take that back. The House now is one shy of a super majority. Senate has a super majority. But internally, and early on, Republicans made it clear that they were not interested in campaign finance reform unless it had what they call an equal voice provision, which is to say no aggregation of any kind of money, no committees, no PACs, nothing. Every entity you can think of, from Nike to Jeff Golden to NRA, is subject to the very same limits. There's only one kind of entity. That would buy us Republican support. Short of that, this is a partisan Democratic project. But among Democrats, we are quite divided between what I think of, and this is subjective, others might describe it differently, between a press the Democratic advantage side and a good government side. So we've had in all the roundtables, all the work groups, we have had a pretty powerful coalition of the biggest Democratic funders, and by far the biggest of those are the unions, and the biggest of those are the public employee unions in terms of dollars donated. We have reproductive choice, we have the environment. Those are the primary ones that give a lot of money. And the other side that I proudly belong to is known shorthand as the good government side. And that's Common Cause and the League of Women Voters and Osberg, or Student Public Interest Research Group, and a few others. And I won't drill down except to say the bill I introduced, which got a hearing but no work, insisted on, basically, let me not take the time to get too technical. The principles that I fought for and am not willing to bend on is that a system has to be understandable. It can't have so many conduits and so many interlocking committees that a reasonably intelligent but not that deeply informed person can't follow the money. You got to be able to follow the money. And second, that no entity be able to write a check to a candidate, a very large distracting check, and we can argue about what that means, if they have an identifiable interest in the outcome of legislation. And my good colleagues who are the unions and others take exception to that and want their committees to have unlimited or very, very high limits on their donations. And they argue that they're not a special interest group. They are working people banding themselves together to make their voices heard when they wouldn't otherwise be heard. And that's very different from, well, in our case, Phil Knight. Phil Knight is our Koch brothers in Oregon and donated almost $3 million in the last gubernatorial election. Nobody says they're like Phil Knight, but I very strongly feel they have an interest that is not the same as the general interest that I am obligated to represent. So we have had a great deal of difficulty trying to bridge that gap. And I think if you polled the Democratic caucuses in both chambers, we would be divided along those lines. And basically, to get philosophical for just a second, I think I'm a progressive Democrat. And I think that we need to forego what is probably a temporary partisan advantage in order to tap into that tremendous hunger that I was talking about earlier for high quality, equitable campaign finance reform. And we will be rewarded politically if we do, because so many people are looking for that, even if it is foregoing some partisan advantages we might have now. I have colleagues who think that's naive, and we have to play hardball and take advantage of what we have right now. But if we do that, well, I don't think we'll get that to the ballot, a really partisan measure. And the last thing I'll say is it's really up for question whether we have the ability to pass what I would consider robust campaign finance reform. I can't count the votes right now that gets us there. And we have in our state, one of the more robust initiative processes in the country, and a group out of Portland called Honest Elections Oregon that has successfully passed really, really serious campaign finance reform. Did so statewide 20 years ago, did so for Portland and Multnomah County, where Portland is located, 4 or 5 years ago. And they are at the ready to do it again. They don't really want to raise the money it would take to successfully pass an initiative measure, given how much money will be brought against it. But they're ready to do it. They can do it. They're basically giving us one more shot in our short 2022 session to produce. And if we don't, we will get campaign finance reform through the initiative process. I could talk all day long, but I won't. Let's see if you have any questions.
Great. Well, thank you, Senator Golden. If anybody has any questions, again, feel free to add them in the chat and we'll circle around with all the panelists once we've heard from everyone. At this point, I'm going to move on to Delegate Sam Rasoul. Most of you are probably familiar with him already, but if not, he's been a delegate in the House of Virginia, House of Delegates since 2014, sits on the Privileges of Elections Committee, and furthermore is a member of the Campaign Finance Subcommittee. So Sam, we were hoping you could kind of give us a similar rundown, but this time about Virginia, and maybe talk a little bit about whether or not some of what we've just heard about from Oregon maybe resonates here in the Commonwealth, and why we're similarly seeing having such a difficult time passing similar legislation.
Yeah, well, thank you, Senator Golden, for joining us, making that long trip over to the Eastern time here. It is a pleasure. And I've always found it fascinating, states like Oregon, and my friend who's a state senator out in Hawaii, where you've got great Democratic majorities, and it's really different Democratic groups and coming together to kind of caucus to figure out what direction we're going to take progressive causes, as opposed to the debates in more swing states like ours and tight legislatures. So thank you for joining us. Several things. I think it's unfortunate that we're talking about that we're only talking about the personal use of campaign funds. I just think that it is unfortunately a bit of a distraction. We're going to hopefully go into our third full session with Democratic control if we can pull off the next 30 days. We've tried over the years. I'm a bit of an idealist. I'll use that word, Senator Golden, but I am myself, and I just believe that we should be investing in ways that build trust, because for me, that's what it boils down to. I think tribally, a small percentage of people consider them tribally Democrats and tribally Republicans, and most people are asking this fundamental question: who's representing me? And it just so happens that we kind of go back and forth with the political discourse, and in the end, most people are asking that fundamental question. That has been my experience, and so that's why over the years I have put in an initiative and referendum process only to be shot down on both sides of the aisle. We found out how unpopular that was when I came into the legislature. As you heard earlier, I put forward a constitutional amendment. There is no real credence, to me, behind for the states being able to lobby, as it says in the Constitution, being able to apply to amend the United States Constitution. to overturn Citizens United. There was no constitution in hand before this constitution. So we had the Articles of Confederation, which was not a constitution. We were a loose conglomeration of 13 sovereign entities, much like the European Union, if you will. From 1776 until 1789, we developed the Constitution at that point, and that Constitution outlines the ways in which we can amend the Constitution. So we had put that forward, but it's an interesting debate for sure. And of course, whatever comes out of the process has to be fully ratified by the states. And we've led on, much like yourself, Senator Golden, myself, and just running a statewide campaign earlier this year, where we proclaimed we're rejecting special interest PAC donations. And again, there are some great PACs and great special interests that take up some good causes. It's more a matter of how we are going to build trust in moving forward. And so here we are in a state where it is truly, in many ways, the Wild West. And fundamentally, I just don't feel as though we have done our part to signal to the electorate here in Virginia, which has not elected a Republican statewide since 2009. But yet we find ourselves in a toss-up statewide race right now, because people fundamentally are asking this question, are you representing my interests? And we haven't really signaled that. We have utilities that have stolen billions of dollars, objectively stolen billions of dollars. They have admitted to overcharging. Our State Corporation Commission has done so. We have legislation that passes that just seems to be light years away from what the will of the electorate is sometimes. And so for me, this is a particularly poignant issue, and I'll close on this, because talking about campaign finance reform is actually pretty tough with a lot of folks. But see, the thing is I'm a Democrat. And as a Democrat, I believe that government has a role in our lives, that institutions play an important role in our lives. And so we bear the burden more than any other party, any other organization, to do everything that we can to build trust in institutions. Because if we're trying to convince people that Medicaid expansion is a good thing, if we're trying to convince them that figuring out how we move forward with a broader, more robust education system, we are asking people to trust institutions. And unfortunately, we are falling short, I think, at the national level and here in Virginia. And so hopefully we can start to turn that corner. But the only way to do that is to build and connect those dots for folks, that the reason why you've got this frustration is because there's this issue that's lurking out there. And so I'm ready to work together with Republicans, Democrats, whoever, to tackle this issue, because this is not, as Senator Golden had said, not a partisan issue. This is something that the people deserve some real progress on.
Thanks, Sam. I mean, I know that Sam has been a strong advocate for good governance, and I just wanted to say, and there was a meeting on a bill that would ban corporate contributions, and we had testimony from both sides, and Sam was in the committee, and Sam made a motion for a vote, and there wasn't a second motion, which I thought that was a little bit, it was disrespectful to the people who came to testify. But I really appreciated you've always been somebody who speaks truth to power. So anyway, let's just hope that something comes out of this subcommittee that is meeting. Before we'll do a last round robin, but I'd like to quickly move to Austin Graham, who was again with the Campaign Legal Center, and he can introduce his role at the Campaign Legal Center. He testified today to the committee that is looking on campaign finance. Specifically, he was talking about disclosure, and he has a lot of experience at looking at state level issues. So I was just hoping that he could sort of take us around the national landscape and saying what's happening in the country in terms of campaign finance.
Great, thanks, Nancy. Yeah, I'm Austin Graham. I'm also with the Campaign Legal Center. Trevor Potter is my boss. but really happy to be here, and thank you all for having me. So at CLC, I focus mainly on state and local campaign finance reform, doing everything from kind of consulting on legislation to trying to shape the regulatory process to litigation. So kind of get the whole spectrum in terms of legal aspects of this issue. And from kind of a 10,000-foot view, I would say that Virginia is, as we keep hearing today, on this campaign finance issue, generally behind what we've seen in most other states. I mean, we don't have limits. There's minimal disclosure for organizations that aren't political action committees. There's nothing like public financing. So, you know, I'd say Virginia is really lagging. And what we've seen elsewhere in states that, you know, in the post-Citizens United era have really kind of capitalized on momentum around money and politics reform, we have seen introduction of good transparency requirements for outside spending groups. We've seen new public financing programs introduced, especially in the cities. And we've seen action on contributions, whether it's new limits, lower limits, or, you know, prohibitions on certain types of entities, corporations, public utilities, being able to give directly to candidates. So we're working now to try to get, you know, that kind of action happening here in Virginia. But you know, as we've seen in around the country, you know, this stuff doesn't happen overnight, and it's important to have, you know, the necessary deliberation and build kind of a strong legislative record that really supports the need for these issues in Virginia. So, but I'll kick it back to you, Nancy, so we can kind of dig into some specific questions.
Sure. Anyway, Heidi, you want to, could you give us an example? One of the issues that legislators seem to use to throw in the air that sort of diverts attention from implementing campaign finance is saying, what is the status of litigation around the country in terms of some of the state laws on campaign finance? Could you give us an overview of that?
I assume that's meant for Austin, or do you want me to answer?
For Austin. For Austin.
Sure. I mean, it varies depending on the issue, but you know, this disclosure has been kind of in the news lately. Some of you may be familiar with the Supreme Court's recent decision in the Americans for Prosperity Foundation v. Bonta, which that case, you know, nominally struck down a California regulation which required charitable organizations to disclose their what are called IRS 990 Schedule Bs, which is basically a list of all your donors of $5,000 or more, to the California Attorney General for non-public purposes. And supposedly the state of California said that the reason why they required that was to help prevent charitable wrongdoing and fraud. But that law was challenged by Americans for Prosperity and another conservative nonprofit group, and, you know, it went all the way up to the Supreme Court. And the court struck that law down as you know, not being narrowly tailored to the interests that the state of California asserted. And it's important, I guess, to distinguish that case from disclosure in the election context, which the Supreme Court, including in Citizens United, has repeatedly upheld by big majorities. So, you know, following Americans for Prosperity, we are still very confident in the constitutionality of campaign finance disclosure. And importantly, earlier, I guess it was last month now, but in September, we had a federal appeals court, the First Circuit, uphold a very comprehensive campaign finance disclosure law in Rhode Island. And there's just really great language in that decision explaining why disclosure is still so important. And importantly, the First Circuit actually employed the exact same analysis that the Supreme Court used in the Americans for Prosperity decision to uphold a campaign finance disclosure law. So disclosure is still very much on firm constitutional ground. And in terms of other issues, contribution limits, you know, we haven't seen the Supreme Court take a case where contribution limits were an issue in a long time. So I think that's good. And public financing, we saw the Supreme Court decline to hear a challenge to Seattle's democracy voucher program, which really interesting system of public financing that we really support at CLC, and I'm happy to talk more about that issue. But yeah, are there any specific cases you had in mind, or is that roundup good?
I think it was specifically the disclosure litigation and Rhode Island, which has a very robust disclosure system. And I think that they basically won their case. So I think the message for a lot of legislators who raise this as a flag is to say, and I hope you agree that the Supreme Court precedent stands, right? That disclosure is
absolutely, absolutely in the election context.
Heidi, do you want to?
Yeah, well, I know we are getting past 8 o'clock already, so I think in the interest of time, if our three panelists, maybe I know Senator Golden has a couple of last remarks. If everybody just wants to kind of wrap it up, maybe make a final comment. And then if anybody has any questions, again, feel free to put them in the chat. For those of us that can stay later, we can talk about them. But yeah, otherwise, Senator Golden, I'll turn it back to you, and then we'll go to Delegate Rasoul.
Thanks, Heidi. I hope we can continue to work together. We're always looking for best practices, and we like to make new mistakes, not mistakes people have already made. So I'd like to keep the dialogue going. I did forget to bring up one significant challenge to a system that has what I would consider reasonable limits, which is smaller numbers than a lot of my colleagues want. And there are a couple of reasons for that, but the one that's the challenge and is a legitimate issue, we get a pushback. Again, the serious conversation to this point in Oregon is only among Democrats. I told you what we need to do in order to get Republican support. And a number of Democrats who I would consider generally aligned with our intent say that we can't have modest limitations, that our limits have to be pretty high, because if they're not, the playing field will tilt even more to independent expenditures that will have this relatively limited pot of money for candidates. I think it's sizable, but my colleagues don't. But I'm not in the big Portland media market either. That if there's not enough money, that we won't be able to compete with independent expenditure, which, because of Citizens United and other Supreme Court decisions, are we're not able to limit them. There's nothing we can do. Well, that's not true. There is something we can do about them. But I think that concern can be overblown and used as an excuse for very high limits. But I acknowledge it's an issue, and I think we need, on another front, to keep pursuing legal challenges to the notion that money is speech, and keep trying to overturn the most harmful elements of Citizens United. So that, and when I say there is something we can do, disclosures do something about that. If disclosure laws are really good and fairly leak-proof, they make a difference. And the one example that we like to cite here was a city council race in Richmond, California, on the north end of San Francisco Bay, which is the home of major Exxon refineries. And they employ a lot of the population. It's a really toxic city because of the effects over time of those refineries. There was a city council race for, I think, 5 seats at the same time, with a oil company slate and an environmental slate, and you can guess which had a lot more money to spend. And because of California disclosure laws, the companies, I'm sorry, they're primarily Chevron refineries. The ads had to say that Chevron had financed the ads, and the Chevron slate was defeated by a very wide margin. So that's not the comprehensive solution to independent expenditures, but it does show what an important piece of this disclosure laws have. So that's what I wanted to say. We are plagued in getting this right, by the inability to limit independent expenditures.
Sam, do you have any last comments? And in particular, I'd like to ask Sam on his advice on building advocacy. You are a strong proponent of building building coalitions across the state. What advice do you have for us as citizens to move this forward?
I mean, for me, I think that it's a struggle when you're talking about campaign finance as an issue in and of itself. And so my best advice would be to ensure that it is always talked in partnership with wherever someone's an entity's frustration is. And so if you're trying to put on this big campaign to let people know that we've got to have some limits here, unless it's tied to something, it's just not going to poll very well as far as being up on people's pecking order. So I think my best advice to build broad coalitions is people are set at their utility bills. I mean, I think in Virginia, the largest tax increase in Virginia history has been the increase in utility costs over the past decade. And you know, everybody's ticked off at their utilities in Virginia. So, or tying it to similar issues, not speaking about it in a silo would be my best advice.
Great, thank you. And then Austin, one of the issues, and I think that Jeff Golden asked about this, and I think it's a really good idea, is sharing best practices. In particular, he brought up the issue of limitations. We have talked about this issue, the balance between the level of limitations and how to get it right. And I know at one point you shared with us the Maryland example where they have $6,000 across the board. What are your views on best practices on this, and how can we all learn from these and use them in our advocacy?
Nancy, do you mean best practices in terms of contribution limits?
Yeah, in contributions, determining what the contributions limit should be. So you do this balance between not attracting dark money, but actually putting in reasonable limits.
Yeah, and that's a really hard balance to strike. And it's hard to say that there's this perfect number that, that's your best practice number. And I think it's a bit of a jurisdiction specific question. What works well in that state or in that city? That being said, I believe that there should be reasonable limits on contributions to candidates and parties. But where those limits lie, really, I think should be something that legislators think pretty significantly about and try to figure out, for our state or for our city, what's the appropriate level where we're comfortable saying, all right, that's it. And that being said, even in states like Virginia where you don't have limits and Oregon as well, we still see significant amounts of dark money spending. And that's because, even if you can give $1 million straight to a candidate, there are incentives to want to hide your identity from the public. So the importance of transparency is still just as strong, in my opinion, in states that don't have limits or have very high limits. And I think that's what makes, disclosure such a priority everywhere.
Well, thanks for that. Heidi, do you see any? I don't see any questions from our audience. It's already 5 after 8. Anybody has a burning question? You can.
There's one question here for Sam about how things are looking this year with Impact Center candidates.
We started the Impact Center right after the 2016 election to ensure that we do 2 things. Train people in kind of the newest way to campaign, really focusing on the moral psychology and neuroscience of trust. And we built a whole curriculum. We've trained about 2,500 people across the Commonwealth. And then second, to be able to make sure that we run strong everywhere. I think it's critically important when we're running on progressive issues that we empower and support candidates in all corners of the Commonwealth, much like the 50-state strategy from years ago. So we wanted to make sure that we're providing that level of support. And you never know, just like we did in 2017, some of these districts where people thought we weren't competitive, we ended up poking through. And just as important is when you force competition on all fronts, it certainly keeps people at bay, keeps them at home, and they're forced to spend money on their own race as opposed to some of these others. I recall back in 2008 when I ran for U.S. House and my neighbor in the 5th Congressional District ran for U.S. House. Neither one of us were expected to win. I fell short, but then Tom Perriello won by 797 votes, which was just a small fraction of a percentage. So I think it's important for us to keep running. We've got about 15 candidates that we are supporting in tier 2, tier 3 races, mainly to make sure we're getting our message out there through funding, through field, however, we can support them. So I hope we'll make sure that we're running strong everywhere this November, with about 31 days left tomorrow.
Well, thanks so much. Oregon is, we're below Oregon on the swamp index, and also just because we have elections every year, I think that it makes it really difficult for Virginia to get advocacy on issues. But anyway, I'd like to thank everybody, thank the speakers. Jeff, if we're trying to develop best practices on campaign finance to feed into the subcommittee, examples from other states, so we hope to contact you. We will be watching vicariously as you introduce another limitations bill next year, just to see how that works. Our priority, I think the subcommittee recognizes we need a regulatory framework, disclosure, and then perhaps limitations on campaign finance will come probably in not this General Assembly, next General Assembly.
If I may make one suggestion I think is helpful, I started out with a list of values or principles. What are we trying to achieve with campaign finance reform, specifically limitations? And I have found that start has a tendency, if people are generally aligned, that really expedites the conversation. Rather than starting with the specifics of a plan or numbers or anything like that, a fairly short list of the values or objectives of your campaign finance system.
Yeah, I think that you're totally right. Everything is in the messaging. And I think that they've done the surveys, 90% of Americans feel like money has too much influence. And I think Republicans and Democrats both recognize that. It's just, it's hard to get it through, but we're working on it. Meanwhile, for those of you who are in organizations, Heidi and I just sent a letter to all the members of the campaign, the subcommittee. It was a sign-on letter. We got 30 organizations to sign it, including some businesses. So we'll continue that to raise the voice of Virginians, and we certainly hope that you join us. I put my name in the chat, Heidi will too. But meanwhile, thanks Austin and the Campaign Legal Center for all your support and your guidance. Jeff, interesting, we'll be watching you vicariously over the next year. And Sam, thanks for all your continued commitment to good governance in our pay-to-play Commonwealth state.
Thanks for what you're doing, and thanks for the invitation to join you.
Thank
you so much. Have a nice evening, everybody.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank